No doubt you've heard, and maybe have even said such things yourself as back in my day or when I was your age. These are aspects of nostalgia and ultimately come from a very common held myth and misconception of the good old days. Hey everyone, my name's Christian Verstappen, and I have a lot to say about many things. I want to talk about the good old days and why they weren't really that good. There's a common phrase that goes, I wish I knew the good days before they were gone. And the reality is, you never can know the good days because there's no such thing. The concept and the idea of the good days is purely based upon nostalgia. And it comes from a bunch of different factors. One of the easiest reasons to understand about this is that nostalgia and kind of pining for younger days blinds you. You see, it's very common for people to think that the time they grew up in is better than the time that is currently existing, the time they're currently living. Why is that in reality? Because I was born in 1997. I grew up in the 2000s. And while I remember the 2000s very fondly, I know for a fact many adults growing up or who were already well into their adult years at that time absolutely didn't. So what's the discrepancy here? Well, oftentimes when you're a kid, you're exploring the world, you're learning about how everything works, and you're not really worrying about day-to-day problems you do in adulthood. Hell, we even have a term for people growing older and not wanting to do adult things called adulting. Now, with these things in mind, there are definitely aspects of ageism that come into play as well. It's very easy to look at generations before or after you and think that yours is just superior just because. It's a fallacy, but it's one that many people fall into. The most common expression of this mentality is the simple and seemingly innocuous statement, kids these days. But it just as well happens on the other side of the spectrum, with people my age or even younger referring to anyone they don't like, they disagree with as boomer, as an insult. Now, the term boomer, baby boomers, is a thing, and Gen Z and millennials are actual things. But when you have young people referring to everyone that they don't like who's older than them as boomers, and you have older people referring to everyone they don't like as millennials, it gets a bit tiring and you can see the ageism kind of playing out. But maybe ageism is a more specific topic I'll cover another day. Right now, we're talking about the good old days. I want to be very upfront about something. I bought into this mentality that the days of yesteryear were better than that of today. Why? Well, a myriad of reasons. For one, I was raised by my grandparents, so that has a lot to do with it. But I just gravitated a lot toward kind of old school rock and roll and entertainment in general. And to this day, I still do love a lot of the pioneers of the genre, with people like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, etc. What I started to say about myself, and I didn't realize how cringy it sounded at the time, was that I really liked the 1950s. Back to the Future is also one of my favorite movies, which largely takes place in the 50s, so this might have had a bit of at least reinforcement in this mentality. But you see, I fell into the idea that many people do today of this concept where the 1950s was this, like, golden age where everything was perfect and there were no problems. I've come to accept now that really what I liked about the 50s was the aesthetic. I love, well, leather jackets, hot rods, rock and roll, all of that stuff. But all of that has, even from then, evolved into different versions that they are today, but they're still the core of what they started as in the 50s. In the 1950s, we saw the birth of malls. Shopping malls, of course. We saw the birth of the concept of teenagers. We saw the birth of, well, driving and doing so for fun. I mean, like, driving existed, but like teenagers driving and doing so for fun and getting out and going to record shops and jukebox bars and all these different kind of places where they just mingled, and it was such a different world from the 40s. Much of what we have as our culture today originated from the 1950s, and it's only been expanded upon and evolved since. And I love it. But there's a dark side to this of things that I don't love, things that I was oblivious to when I would say things like, I really like the 1950s. See, I didn't know it at the time, but especially more recently, idolizing the 1950s and 60s, but especially the 50s, has very much become an alt-right Nazi dog whistle. I wasn't aware of that at the time, and when I say, again, I love the aesthetic, I do. As I started to learn more about kind of the negative aspects of the 50s, I would refine my statement to say, I love the 50s except for the racism, homophobia, and sexism. You could expand that even now to, as I've learned even more about the spousal abuse, which of course was a part of the sexism, but that leads me to another point. Spousal abuse was much higher than it is today. Suicide, especially by males, was much higher than today. Statistically, the world has gotten better by every metric. We're more progressive and accepting of other people. All of the things that I mentioned that are good things as concepts that were introduced in the 1950s have been expanded upon and evolved since then, to the point where, while some are a bit kind of over-commercialized and you may even say have kind of lost their soul, a lot of it still retains what it originated as. Rock and roll and music really being this idea to kind of express yourself and stick to the man and discuss complicated political issues. Entertainment really kind of breaking from the mold and becoming this place, this grounds where anything could be discussed, anything could be challenged, and nothing was off limits. An anti-authoritarian movement that eventually led to the counterculture of the 60s and the free love movement of the 70s, which both, even those, had their issues as well. But the point with all of this is, there are good aspects and there are bad aspects to everything. While today we have people's rights being restricted, we have global climate change really becoming more and more of an issue. We have people polarized on all sides of political and philosophical, every kind of aisle there is, and discussions and differences there are to be had. People are having them. People are absolutely having them. And in a world where we feel more divided from our fellow neighbor than maybe we did years ago, we also have the age of the internet, where information for anything is at our fingertips. We can connect to people from way across the world where we would have never had the ability to connect with them previously. We can constantly learn about new things and be exposed to all kinds of new ideas. And statistically, crime, especially violent crime, has been going down in the past several decades. There were, of course, spikes in crime that occurred during the events of 2020, but a lot of that was due to things like lockdown. We have the ability to fight off diseases now that we would have never even dreamed of before. We have so much at our fingertips, and we're constantly evolving, constantly learning. We're constantly progressing and getting better as a world, as a human species. Yes, we have some really bad, difficult issues that we need to tackle, and ultimately we need to do that together. And yes, it can be easy, whether you're looking past at times you might not even been born or lived through, like the 50s or the 60s, or you look back at the 90s, the 80s, the 2000s, when you were a child, any of this stuff, and you think, man, it was just so much better back then. The reality is, it wasn't. Just as every period of your life, every period of the world has its own issues to deal with. There will always be good, and there will always be bad. And we can work to make things better. And it's important to hold on to the things that made previous generations good, while throwing out the things that are more antiquated, things that don't work, things that limit and hurt people. But it's not all bad. Back then, nor now. Remember that similar to how the grass is always greener on the other side, perspective is reality, and as such, this applies to time as well. So just remember, yes, we are dealing with issues. People have dealt with issues in the past. People will continue to deal with issues in the future. But whatever the case, we can overcome them, just like we have before, just like we will in the future. As always, though, those are just my thoughts. Let me know what yours are in the comments down below. Follow me on social media for more, links in the description. Subscribe and ring the bell to stay up to date. Leave a like if you like, and if not, I hope you find something to do like. Later, guys. Peace and love.